Hello, welcome to the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book, presenting Transformative Desire, Literary Fiction. I'm Sarah Lawson, Associate Director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thanks for joining us. A couple notes before we begin. Please share your questions for the authors using the Q&A tab on Zoom. Also, this event has optional closed captioning which you can turn on and customize at any time with the tab at the bottom of your window. If you haven't already read today's books, we hope you will. For details about how to buy them from a local bookseller, visit vabook.org, where you can also explore the schedule of upcoming programs and watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. We appreciate the support of our community partner for this event, the UVA LGBT Committee for Faculty and Staff. Thanks also to our bookseller for this event, Fountain Bookstore in Richmond, Virginia. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Alex DeFrancesco, author of Transmutation, has published fiction in The Carolina Quarterly, New Ohio Review, and Monkey Bicycle. They are a winner of Sundress Academy for the Arts 2017 Outspoken Contest for LGBTQ+ writing, and Transmutation is their first short story collection. Lindsay Mirbaum, author of The Gold Persimmon, is a queer feminist and high priestess of home mixology. Her short fiction has been nominated for a Pushcart, among other prizes, and her essays have appeared in Dame, Electric Literature, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. She lives in Michigan. Morgan Thomas, author of Manyware, has had work published in The Atlantic, The Kenyon Review, American Short Fiction, Them, and Story Quarterly, where their story won the 2019 Fiction Prize. A graduate of the University of Oregon MFA program, they live in Portland, Oregon. And our moderator, Nicole Fenton, is a writer, editor, designer, and the co-author of Nicely Said, Writing for the Web with Style and Purpose. Thank you all for joining us today. Nicole, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to everyone who's here today or tuning into the recording after the fact. It's an honor to be here with these three incredible writers today. I really enjoyed reading their work, and I am excited that they'll read to you as well and share some of it with you today. We're going to be exploring the idea of transformative desire, how it shapes identity, the body, our relationships, and the stories we tell. And we're going to hear from each of the authors. They'll talk about their book briefly and do a reading, and then we'll be taking questions and having a discussion. So I want to invite our panelists to read, and Alex, would you start and kick us off with part of Transmutation?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah and Nicole and Virginia Festival of the Book. And thank you so much, Morgan and Lindsay, as well. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. Transmutation is a collection of short stories where monsters and outsiders are the sympathetic characters. And it's an LGBTQ collection. There's a lot of transness and queerness throughout the pages of this collection. And right now I'll be reading from a story called The Pure. In this story, the narrator is a vampire. She is speaking to her human lover, Thane, who is a trans man, and they're falling in love. And I'm going to mention The Pure, which The Pure is the name that for people who are humans who misunderstand and hate vampires and trans people. So yeah, I'm going to read from this briefly. Once I asked a question about his childhood, and a smooth blankness fell over his face. He looked up, searched his mind, found only the slick surface of forgetting. His face contorted, his sharp chin dimpled and went soft. He couldn't remember. After effects of the electroshock therapy his parents had signed off on when he was younger. It had been designed to make him forget who he was, to be someone else. Once he woke up in the day asking where he was, who I was. His thin arms and slight back were covered in sweat. He shook. I have seen the fear that was in his eyes, only in The Hunted. The light around the edges of the blackout curtain disoriented me, but Thane's fear made me calm. Light could not do to me what had been done to him. I wrapped my arms around him and repeated my name, his name, the date, the street where I lived, the name of the city, the state, the country, the continent, the planet. And then later in the story is this section. A door slammed open, spilling sunlight all over. I began to feel nauseated. They're threatening to come after me, he said. He was wild with fear. Who, Thane? Who? The same doctors, the ones with the electricity, and they'll let them do it again. Thane, please calm down. No, no, he said, they can't do it again. You won't let them, will you? You'll change me first? Please do it now before they come. I held him, trying to calm him. Not now, Thane, not like this, not with all this terror. I closed the door, still feeling sick to my stomach. The darkness wrapped its arms around me just as I put mine around Thane. He pulled his hair and wept into his hands. I held him until he fell asleep. We awoke at sunset. He peeked around the edges of the curtain to the descending orb. It has never been able to hurt me as it is sinking as the light becomes swollen and orange. I still want you to, he said. I want to stay. I want this forever. He was calm, collected, so unlike the person he'd been that morning. As he said those words, some of the weight seemed to lift off him. I rose from the bed. My long hair swept down my back as I walked towards the window and him. In the dying light, I put my mouth on his neck. The taste of his blood ran through my lips, warm, sweet, metallic, him. The longer I kept my mouth on him, the weaker his body went. Not just the life, but the sadness was slipping away. I choked on it at first, recognizing its bitterness, but I was stronger than it was. It flowed through me and away. Finally, I pulled back. The person he was gone. There was a long pause before I felt his heart wake up, sluggish at first, then beating with new strength. The ace bandages had slipped down his flat chest, around his waist. His features had changed ever so slightly, but I could see how. I could see all the sadness was gone. Hello, he said, blinking, standing in his new self. Hello, I smiled.
Thank you so much, Alex. It was definitely one of my favorite stories in your collection. All right, let's hear from Lindsay now. Lindsay is the author of a very suspenseful novel, The Gold Persimmon. Hi, Lindsay. Oh, you're on mute.
Whoops, always do that. Hi, everybody. I'm so thankful to be here. It's such an honor, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about The Gold Persimmon, which is my debut queer experimental feminist horror novel from Creature Publishing, which is a feminist horror press. This is a dual narrative story of two uniquely strange and strangely unique hotels in New York City. One is the Gold Persimmon, a hotel really designed for grieving, and the Red Orchid, which is a chic sex hotel in the Japanese style. And the story is really about the mysteries born of these hotels' occupants' grief and trauma, and that they both connect and separate the hotels at the same time, each embodying a different reality. So I'm going to read a little bit from part 2 of this book. At this point, we have been introduced to Jamie, our narrator of this portion, who's a young writer who's non-binary and struggling with their reality and career. And they are trapped inside the Red Orchid, the sex hotel, with 6 other people, and have just gone to the kitchen with a group of cis women, realizing at this point that something is very wrong. They kind of go into a little bit of a frenzied panic. So I'll read just a little bit of this portion. Suddenly we were feasting frantically, gnawing on hunks of cheese, dipping carrot slices in ranch dressing, stuffing our mouths with various meats and berries and cake, plus the omelets Ruth made for all of us, which were light and fluffy, with shredded spinach, the cheese gooey and salty. We munched on croutons and crackers and sardines, devoured a box of jelly donuts someone found stashed in a cabinet, washing it all down with a nice Malbec Josiah uncorked. We passed it around, pressing our lips to it one after the other, the neck sticky and slick from our dirty, jelly-covered fingers. While the music beat on, its optimism undeterred by the giant, menacing cloud advancing on the city. Delirious, full to bursting, I took another dive into the pie, and Adrian picked it up, offering me the whole thing, then pressed my face into it, laughing. I threw a fistful of berries at her, but she ducked, and they splattered like viscera on the floor. Josiah rubbed her legs and feet down with olive oil. She slid across the floor, trailed by glistening snail streaks. Was the same pop song just playing over and over? We ate and ate till Ruth threw up in the sink, holding her own hair back. Then we were thirsty. Ruth washed away the puke and we drank cold water straight from the tap. It ran down our shirt fronts, blotting the stains. By the end, we were sleepy and swollen, lying half curled up on the floor or atop the steel counters. Josiah drained the last drop of wine, knocked the bottle on its side, and let it spin. "Let's play spin the bottle," she said and laughed. She gave it a turn. It landed on no one. "Come closer," she called to us, and we drew toward her as if compelled, past the fridge, close to the door, where the mat stopped and the cold tile began, our eyes heavy, faces smeared with various delicacies. Adrienne lay down in a half-assed yoga pose, her back flat against the floor. Josiah spun again. This time the bottle selected Ruth. She giggled, shook her head. No, she wouldn't play. Josiah crawled toward her on her hands and knees, planted a 3-second kiss, I counted, hard on her mouth. They all laughed. "Now you spin." Ruth landed on the pantry. Closer, closer, Josiah gestured for us to move in, tighten up the circle. Her eyes were half closed. She'd probably gotten the lion's share of the wine. Well, why not? There were more bottles, enough for us to each have one, or to have several if we wanted. Adrienne probably wasn't of age, but what did it matter? Ruth spun again. She got me. Adrienne and Josiah whooped and hollered. I sat there, a smile frozen on my face, my heart racing. Now she had to touch me, but she wouldn't want to. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lindsay. There's so much in that scene. I really like that. Now let's hear from Morgan. Morgan is the author of Manyware, a story collection that explores queer histories, but also the here and now. Hi, Morgan.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And thanks, Alex and Lindsay. It's lovely to hear you both read. Manyware is a short story collection that follows queer and genderqueer Southerners across geographic borders, as well as gender binaries as they search for lineage and community. And I'll be reading the beginning of the short story Bump, which I hope speaks to today's theme. To those who accuse me of immoderate desire, I say, look at the oil executives, look at the gold rush, look at all the women who want a ring and romance and lifelong commitment, and then look again at me. Me, I just want a person to dance the two-step with on Friday nights, a person who won't mind if I wear a shirt with maroon sequins or occasionally a strap-on pregnancy bump. In return, I offer a woman who can get by on little. I keep myself spotless, my car and my nails and my resume I polish myself until I shine. The first thing that drew me to Len was that anyone could tell this was a man who had worked to be where he was and would work to stay there. Born on a cattle ranch an hour outside Gainesville, he'd made partner at an Atlanta law firm, the firm that once represented Coca-Cola against the state. He wore a suit and tie to work even on casual Fridays. He had no Southern accent. On our first date, I asked him about the accent. He said, I did away with it, like it was nothing, doing away with a whole part of yourself. When I talk about polish, this is what I mean. Representing Coca-Cola is reprehensible, of course, and I've told him this, but still I admire his dedication. When I told him on our third date I was trans, he said that makes no difference. Another reason I love him, not like my Nana who had a conniption, said I was risking my job and my health and her livelihood in the bargains that she lived with me and counted on me to provide for her. And I did lose that first job. I made mistakes. I worked a miserable job for 6 years just for the health insurance. But a year ago, I got a new part-time job, a better job, and here I am. Len didn't care I was trans. Now I think maybe I should have asked for more than ambivalence, but for 3 years, I was happy with Len. Friday evenings, we danced the two-step at Dig Down and he maneuvered me expertly through the crowd. He never trod on my foot, not once. Weekends, he came over and cooked pasta. Sometimes when he was feeling ambitious, he cooked crepes. He was devoted to me. His crepes were terrible. His wife, Melinda, sometimes invited me to the nail salon or for sushi. I was grateful to her for the invitations, though I always declined. We were cordial, Melinda and I. We understood how to fit together, how to help each other. We both believed it was a good thing, even a relieving thing, to divide up the responsibility of caring for a man. With Len, for the first time in my life, I could honestly say I am content. That's something.
Thanks, Morgan. And if y'all want to read that story, obviously it's in Manyware, but it's also in the Atlantic, where you can read it online, which is pretty great. Thank you so much for reading your work. And let's move on to our discussion. I just want to remind everyone that you can leave questions in the Q&A panel, and I'll be pulling those into the discussion. We definitely want to have, the audience voice in this. But I'll start with the question that I have. When I was reading your work, I was thinking about the power of desire for the writer in wanting to see these kinds of works like make their way into the world. And so I would love to hear what was the impetus for your book, and how did you how have your hopes changed over time as you kind of went from imagining the project to having it out in the world now? And Morgan, will you start us off?
Yes, happy to start this one. So when I began writing the stories that became Manyware, I was really seeking models for gender queer and queer identities. I was trying to figure out my own gender identity and sexuality. And I was looking around me for elders, for people who had lived longer than I had, and looking for a sort of life arc to offer myself the hope of living a long and fulfilling life as a queer and genderqueer person. And I wasn't finding those models in my immediate community. And so a friend happened to tell me about a person, Frank Woodhull, who lived in the early 20th century. And I started to research this person and felt like their gender identity was in some ways akin to my own. And that led me on a search through the archives to find other historical queer and genderqueer figures. And that kinship and that sense of community was the first thing that I think I wanted Manyware to offer those who read it. However, increasingly, as I wrote and revised these stories, I became skeptical of that kinship, skeptical of the reality of it. Like, who am I to impose my own 21st century understandings of gender on someone who lived 100 years ago or 400 years ago? And so I think at this point in the writing of these stories, I also hope that people who read Manyware engage with their own constructed self-identities and the myths that they've created about themselves, and ask to whom they're accountable for those myths and stories, and who might be overlooked within them, and engage sort of critically with their own storying of identity, whomever they are.
Lindsay or Alex, did you want to share anything about the impetus of your book and how that wanting has changed over time?
Yeah, so I actually dedicated this book to my dad, who passed away probably about 21 years ago now. And the reason it's dedicated to him is because some of my earliest memories are watching The Twilight Zone with him. So a lot of these stories ended up being kind of like me coming back to the roots of really enjoying sci-fi and gothic and stuff like that as a child. So the kind of idea then was okay, so I was this child who was watching The Twilight Zone, who was a little trans kid, and there's obviously no representation for trans people in this sci-fi show from the 1950s or 60s. So this was sort of the idea for me in a lot of ways. There were a couple different starting points for this, but one of them was putting the things that I had always really loved as a child into the world. Not only for young people, but for people like me who are sort of, older and still have these very fond memories of their local legend books and stuff like that. And it's okay, well, just inserting some trans identity into those stories can't be a bad thing. I don't know that it's changed much from the time I started it till the time I put it out. I also think another important part of it is that I was studying the Gothic genre a little bit. when I started this, and there was this really important thing that I read about vampires being like outsiders to like colonialist empires and stuff like that, and like how many monsters through history are like outsiders to like the dominant like paradigm of whatever's going on. So that made me really feel like sympathy and empathy and connection to monsters. So yeah, I think that was another thing of like exploring the monstrous as like a person who is an outsider to a lot of things.
When you were talking about kind of those Gothic stories, I was thinking about myths, which are a big part of Lindsay's work. I think the main character in the first half is Clytemnestra, right? Who's, I'd love to just, I don't know if you want to touch on that or if that relates to the impetus to your book.
Yeah, I'm a huge mythology nerd, and it tends to come out in all of my work, whether I intend for it or not. And I get a lot of questions about Clytemnestra's name. Her parents are European, her father is Greek, and she, as a fictional character, is quite different from the historical mythological character who's in some versions kind of a vixen, or a woman scorned, but either way commits murder, takes a lover, violates all these taboos. I think that's maybe what my character Clytemnestra, honestly, I think that's what her parents hoped for her to become, was that level of powerful and taboo breaking. And that's not really quite the person that she turns out to be. She's quiet, introspective, kind of a loner, has trouble connecting with other people, and finds solace working in this very bizarre hotel where people are insulated in these plush, luxurious rooms where they cannot hear anyone outside, where there is no outside access. And she sees herself as this kind of priestess offering them safe passage when they come into the hotel as someone who works an assigned check-in desk. But honestly, when writing this book, I thought a lot about the Minotaur. The process of writing itself as a dual narrative story, for me, actually felt like being lost in a labyrinth for some years. It organically turned into two narratives, and I had a really interesting time figuring out how to make that connect in an experimental sort of way, and how to use that to talk about grief, to talk about sex, and talk about the nature of storytelling itself. So I thought a lot about that story of this monster who's born because his parents broke a taboo, and the punishment is heaped on him for that. And he's, sent to the center of this labyrinth where every year virgin youths are sent after him. And when they reach the center, when they find the center, then they're eaten, which is a rather horrifying success to find the middle and then to have that be your doom. So I thought a lot about that, I think, because it sort of mirrored in some way my own experience of wandering through this story, wandering through these very strange hotel rooms, each one filled with grief, with loneliness, with desire, and trying to figure out what was there, and also in the end, how to get out and how to get the characters out of that. So mythology comes up a lot. I just can't resist it because there's so much there already to work with. There's so much epic storytelling that's very economical in the way it's delivered, and a lot that's unexplored because of that, in terms especially of the female character's experience.
I'm wondering, like, both with mythology, with Gothic stories, like, I was struck in reading about your works. A lot of them are described as like genre defying or experimental, right? And I wonder, like, how do y'all feel about that? Like, do you see that is a goal, or is that kind of almost like a cis interpretation of the work of like, we have to like throw these different things together to come up with something new? I'm just curious, like, what your perspective is on that, kind of bringing different narratives together to tell a story that is inherently queer.
I'll jump in. Yeah, my novel, The Gold Persimmon, is described as experimental. I honestly did not think of it as such when I was writing it. To me, it actually isn't experimental at all. There are two stories that are connected on a metaphoric level, but also on a literal level, though not everyone sees it that way, which is fine because I feel that every reader's experience of a text is their own unique experience and it should be honored. And it's interesting to see how a work affects someone. But in some ways, I do feel that that is a reflection of the way in which I might have queered the narrative a little bit and defied some expectations. But I really didn't write with certain genre in mind. I didn't really even know what genre would apply until other people started reading it and telling me what it was. And then something sort of clicked, and feminist horror, for example, gives a really interesting framework with which to discuss it because it's not traditional horror. So there's an element there that promotes discussion of trauma, of violence, of gender dynamics. But I don't know about you guys, but I personally, that was not what I was thinking about. I was just trying to write the story that I wanted to see in the world, but also that was in my mind that I needed to get out.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Alex.
Sorry. Yeah, I would say that like in terms of like experimental or genre defying, like these stories feel very not experimental to me. But I was writing them in conjunction with writing an experimental novel. So I think that's part of why they didn't get as much of the experimental. And then in terms of like genre, I feel that genre is a really interesting framework and tool, but as far as like following the rules of it, I am very much you use the rules that make sense for the framework for the story you want to tell, and you throw the rest out. I know that there's a lot of like hardcore genre fans who don't feel that way. So I think that may be where the genre defying kind of comes from.
I think within my work, I've been asked about like speculative and fantastic elements. And I think that those appear in the stories where they appear because these stories are interested centrally in asking questions about how we build and create mythology, which is itself like self-mythology, and also like queer mythologies. And those are essentially like acts of speculation and of creation. And the work is really interested in like orally told stories and the way that stories evolve as they're told from person to person or passed down from generation to generation. And so again, I think fantastic elements come in there. And then last, I would just say that I think at moments I found myself deliberately writing toward moments of queer joy and of like queer desire that is in fact like consummated, achieved, and that often felt itself like an act of speculation or a sort of a fantastic leap, given at points the moment in which we're living and the ways that it circumscribes our gender identities in our lives.
Yeah, I think, when I was initially thinking about our theme, right? It's like transformative desire. Like my first thought was sex, right? Like I think especially for queer and trans people, like sex is a place where that becomes possible, right? In private spaces and in intimate spaces. But I think sometimes in the work, right, I was really also interested in how y'all were exploring the tension between desire and control. And I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit. It comes up in sex, but also in other ways.
I can jump in first if that's okay. So in the story that I read, there was this notion of this person who was trans and on one hand had parents who had like subjected him to conversion therapy. But on the other hand, there was this monster that came along who was like, I can't actually make you anything but what you choose to be. So I felt like that was like a tension that like came through a lot of stories, because in a lot of these stories, there is the world that views the monsters as a monster. And then there are the fellow monsters who are just kind of like out for everybody's well-being, sort of. So yeah, I think that actually informs a lot of the tensions in the stories in my collection.
Yeah, I really love this question and have been thinking about it, Nicole. I think that in Manyware, desire threatens control, that it threatens stability and ongoingness. I think often in these stories, there's a relatively stable sort of everyday life that is overturned because of a character's sort of overwhelming desire. And I think here of a story called The Daring Life of Philip the Cook the Rogue, in which a young genderqueer person ends a relatively stable relationship and basically overturns their entire life to pursue a romance of historical affinity with a person who lived like centuries before in colonial Jamestown. And I think often in these stories, there's a moment when that desire, there's like a temporary joy that often comes from the chasing of that desire. And it felt important to offer each of my characters that space of joy. And also, I think often that space is temporary, and the desire, however it might be fulfilled or unfulfilled, is often eventually sort of lost in the space of grief, which again, I think I'm just thinking about the ways that the characters are circumscribed by the world in which they're living.
That resonates so
Well,
much. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Lindsay. Yeah, I wanted to give you time to.
Thank you. Morgan, that resonates so much with what I was just thinking about in terms of my own novel. But desire is a big theme. I mean, there's a sex hotel, you know, people say, oh, this is a very sexy book. There's so much sex in it. Actually, I don't think there really is that much sex. I mean, okay, there's a lot of dildos around and things, but you know, that doesn't necessarily mean action. But ultimately the desire, some of it is really physical and, you know, for another person, which does lead into some monster-like characters. For example, there's a situation of abuse in a lesbian relationship in my novel, but the desire is also so much bigger than that in terms of a desire to understand oneself, a desire to figure out one's identity, a desire for the things lost, which again ties into this notion of grief. And somehow there seems to be this knife edge between grief and desire that comes up a lot. So it's such an interesting question, and it's wonderful to sort of meditate on. I also think of desire and, you know, sexual action as transformative in terms of altered consciousness, but also altered state of being. And you know, the main characters in my novel are young people who really haven't figured themselves out yet, but are up against some pretty insurmountable odds and some tremendous grief. And I think that, you know, really comes into play there. So I'll just say that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed kind of getting to know Cly and seeing her kind of almost paralysis in the, like, I don't know, the mix of her like sexual desires and her kind of loneliness and grief and all that. I don't know. I just I found that part of the book to just be very rich. So I think Morgan, you were touching on something that around the cost of kind of being seen and following that desire, following the want, whether it's you know, intimacy or actually like something someone's just driven to do, or wanting to be seen in a different way or present a different way. And I felt like there's a line in Alex's book that kind of just distills the cost of being trans in the world in a very powerful way. A character, Lisa, says, you know, maybe if you just didn't wear your binder to work, you'd make the money you used to. And this is kind of spoken to a character who's wait staff, I believe, you know, at a restaurant. And I just wonder if y'all might talk a little bit more about the cost of being visible and how that kind of affects the characters in your books.
I guess I'll jump in here. So I actually have like different thoughts on this than I used to. And a lot of the stories in this book end up taking place more in the Midwest than the place I used to live. I used to live in New York City, and I moved out to Cleveland, Ohio a couple of years ago. So for me, if I had written something about visibility when I was living in New York, I would have said, okay, there's no downside. Like there's, you know, maybe like some tensions with like people in your life from like the past, and those don't compare to the fact that like there's so much like found family and community and all the wonderful things that you gain from being visible. But my thoughts on that have changed since I kind of came a little bit further into the middle of the country. And I would say the risks end up being a lot of loss. And those losses that maybe didn't seem as significant to me when I was surrounded by an extremely accessible queer community in New York City are a lot more apparent to me now. So a lot of the characters in this book are then in the place that's more geographically like I'm at now, dealing with these losses. And there's this one story at the very beginning called Inside My Saffron Cave, where this young woman is, she's transitioning, she's 17 years old, and she's just moved in with her mom's abusive boyfriend, and her mom has too, and her little brother has. And the only person that she can connect to ends up being this legend of like this storm hag that would call like sailors down to like their graves, right? So she is like completely isolated, and she has no question about whether or not she's going to be visible, but the world around her has changed its answer about her visibility once it happens. So I think that a lot of this book wouldn't have been written were I still living in a place where queer community was readily accessible at all times, and a lot of the costs wouldn't have been as apparent to me.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I want to jump in because I think I agree a lot about the way that this question sort of isn't scalable, that it's local and regional. I moved in September from Portland, Oregon to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I was here when Marquisha Lawrence was killed, and we had like this sort of spate of articles suddenly saying that like 2021 was the most dangerous year for trans people, which seems like those articles come out every year. So the costs, I think, are massive and clear and constant. And I also, whenever I consider this question, think about my privilege being a white person and an AFAB person, and the way that I'm protected by those axes of identities as well. But I think the thing that I've been thinking about on this front is the way that possibly like visibility and invisibility itself is a false binary, or the way that there are so many different axes of visibility, so many ways to be visible. And I'm thinking about this regionally. So in Oregon, it was really easy to be read as a genderqueer person, to have they them pronouns used. Here in South Carolina, I get like she pronouns and he pronouns sort of equally. And at first that bothered me or sort of upset something internally regarding gender identity. And I felt myself reaching for like a more masculine sort of presentation. I wanted like the relative affirmation of being misgendered as a man. But I've realized that that itself is a sort of gender fluid visibility. It's just a different type of gender fluid visibility than the they them pronouns in Portland, Oregon. And there's also like when I'm out with my genderqueer partner and one of us is read as a man and one of us is read as a woman, like we're being read as a straight couple, which is sort of invisibility, but also like one of us is being read as a man, which is a sort of visibility. So it started to feel honestly just really complicated for me. And I think that the last thing that I'll say is just that it also feels here in Spartanburg, like I've noticed like visibility feels newly important, I think. In Portland, it didn't really seem like anyone cared if I was a genderqueer person. And here I was with my partner at a silent disco downtown, and we were dancing crazily as we do. And these like two young people came up to us and just like told us about being queer and being gender fluid. And I think there's a sense of visibility offering something to the people around you here that I hadn't felt in Portland.
So we haven't gotten any questions in the Q&A panel, but I wonder, are there any questions that y'all want to ask each other? Like, I always think that's an interesting part of the conversation too.
I'm really curious. I think, Nicole, you might be asking a question later about language, but I really struggled at first, especially as I was writing non-binary and genderqueer characters, just with embodiment, with actually like describing bodies on the page, I had this moment where I felt like any description I used was freighted with like connotations of gender one way or another. And I just wonder how both of you think about embodiment and how you think about offering your characters that like physical, real space on the page.
That's a really interesting question. For me, my novel is very much about disembodiment, actually, which is something that a lot of readers have talked to me about, or that's resonated with a lot of readers. So the two main characters are Cly and Jamie. Cly is cisgender, but both of them are people who sort of strive for invisibility. And Cly experiences a lot of disassociation and disembodiment from herself as a result of just kind of an inability to cope with what's expected of her, also tremendous grief and trauma. For Jamie, the other main character who's non-binary, they talk a lot to the reader about, they talk about their body from a distance, mainly from the perspective of thinking of how their body will be perceived by others, and of course, by extension, their gender. And they end up in a situation of conflict, coming up against, this kind of monstrously toxic male character who is just kind of threatened by their very existence, by the inability to look at them and just quickly read them a certain way. And so they talk about, for example, the moment of reaching a door to open a door at the same time as a cis man, and the minute moment of gender conflict over who's going to open the door for whom. And they say something like, it's as if like he's reaching for Moses's tablet or something, like it's so important to be the first to open the door. But at the same time, they really kind of disassociate a lot from their physical body and from the way that others perceive it, which I think is kind of really hard not to do if, for those of us who are female bodied, especially just because of the automatic pressure and assumption and analysis that comes with being female bodied, that's external in our culture, that pushes you to kind of see yourself from the outside at all times, for various purposes, or to be attractive, for example, or to be sexy, or and then how that translates, and additionally, in terms of gender nonconformity, that still remains there, that kind of trauma of being pushed to see yourself from the outside and to never be able to just relax into yourself, the permanence of that awareness. So that's something that I really explored a lot in this novel, but I find that it comes out just a lot in my fiction in general, this idea of separating from the body and examining the body as its own entity. And I guess some of that stems from my own experience, but it's a really interesting question. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, I actually had this question. I was doing in conversation with Jane Thornton, who wrote Summer Fun a while ago, and something like this question sort of came up where we were talking about, we ended up segueing from how trans writers kind of tend to have like some like visceral sort of like body kind of talk running through their work, to the notion that the idea of like, when you're like in a sexual experience with two trans people in it, where you're like actually talking about bodies beforehand instead of making assumptions, like, how do you like to be touched? Like, what do you like to call like various body parts of yours? And I think that there's definitely like something I've noticed with a lot of trans writing where it's very viscerally more able to make those sort of like things happen in conversation about the body. And there are two pieces in my short story collection where I really kind of went into like some sort of visceralness about the body. And one is there's a short story about Rosemary Kennedy. It's not about Rosemary Kennedy, but it's based on her lobotomy. And the character who is based on Rosemary Kennedy steals the sort of ice pick instrument from the lobotomist's office and then masturbates with it later. So it's kind of like this very like visceral moment. And then there's another moment where it's a story based on, I don't know if anyone remembers Bob Hickok's like awful rant about how he's being disappeared by minority poets in like a journal a while ago, but it's based on that. And there's a moment in it where this adjunct professor kind of goes up to the Bob Hickok stand-in in the story, and just the Bob Hickok stand-in is disappearing physically and his body is like slowly eroding. And the adjunct professor just sort of like sucks him through a straw and spits him out. And there's like pieces of like his beard on like the adjunct professor's lips and stuff. So I think those are two moments when I got to do like a little like bit of body horror with like this sort of idea that talking about the body is a thing that we kind of need to do, because bodies are, you know, to be a trans person means that like in some ways like you may need to reassess your relationship with your body. Not everybody, certainly, but that also means that when you're interacting with other people who are trans, like you can't make any assumptions. But that's something that like you also probably shouldn't be doing for anyone, right? So I think it just opens up this space for trans writers to talk about the body in a way that like maybe we haven't really been doing because we've been making a lot of assumptions in the past.
Well, and I think to go back to the heart of your question, Morgan, about like grappling with that language, like I think for a lot of queer people, the body has not been a safe place to be, right? Whether you're targeted or you've experienced trauma or you know, you have dysphoria, like I think all of these things can kind of add up to, it's hard to talk about the body when that is the kind of place where all of the tension is, right? So we did get one question from the audience. Could y'all recommend any books in particular, books that may have not gotten as much publicity as you think they deserved? Maybe things that you kind of carry in your, you know, lineage or, you know, your pocket mentally.
I always jump in and recommend Indra Das's The Devourers, which is a trans werewolf story that takes place in ancient, or not, yeah, it is a trans werewolf story. The werewolves aren't all trans, but there are some trans werewolves who it takes place in ancient and modern India. And it's just so wonderful and visceral and poetic and beautiful. And I always recommend that one.
I really love J.D. Scott's Moonflower Nightshade, All the Hours of the Day. It's a long, wonderful title. It's a collection of short stories and one novella from a small press, I forget which. I'm actually teaching this book for a class at Politics and Prose this summer on queer magical realism. So it's like fabulous, magical realist, just very beautiful and inventive. And also, same author released a book of poetry, I think last year, Mask for Mask, which is quite experimental, you know, and really just really interesting work that kind of, I think explores the way in which, you know, fabulism, magical realism can translate into queer fiction. And again, that concept of queering the narrative, the way that queerness can be a vehicle for the magic or vice versa. I think that the parallel there is something really important to explore. And it's also just gorgeous writing. So I'll always plug that author.
These books sound great. I'm taking notes. And I would recommend two upcoming books that I'm really excited about. One is Rhys Nielsen's Deep in Providence, which is a YA novel that is very magical, very queer, and very, very good. And then the other is a queer ecological nonfiction book, Underflows by Cleo Wolfel-Hazard, which is out this month and speaks about trans ecologies and river justice in ways that I think are incredible and deeply entangled.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna add these to my reading list too. So I think we have time for one more question. I guess I'll jump in with another one of my questions here. Let's see. I guess generally, thinking, I'm like, we kind of went through all of these. I guess I wonder, just writer to writer, do you have any advice for other writers that want to write queer stories, having gone through this? I think that might be interesting for the audience.
I would say that pick your beta readers very carefully, because if you're forced into a situation, say if you're like in a writing program or something, where it's just like people who don't necessarily read queer fiction or maybe understand exactly where you're coming from, you're going to get a lot of feedback early on that like you need to explain yourself, and you don't need to explain yourself. You just need to tell your stories.
I would agree with that completely. I've had people say to me, oh, you know, the Gold Persimmon really doesn't explain for the cis heterosexual, you know, reader what you're talking about. And to me, I'm going, oh, okay, I didn't know that needed to happen. You know what I mean? To me, it's just sort of tell your story the way that you can tell it, the way that only you can tell it. And yeah, be prepared for that kind of pushback, you know, knowing your audience, but also kind of remain true to that. And if you can, find other queer authors to commune with, to share work with, because you will get a different level of understanding, but also that community will buoy you. And that's really important.
Yes, I second all of this. And I think a question that I've received a few times in previous events from young, or not young, but just from queer and trans writers is, how do you write understanding the stereotypes that continue to be perpetuated for queer and trans people? And I think often folks will say that they feel like circumscribed by those, or hemmed in, or like they can't write because they're afraid of in some way perpetuating those stereotypes. And so I think to that, I would just say that it's important both to be aware of those stereotypes and those narratives, and also not to write in fear of them, and not to allow like cis hetero narratives of trans and queer people to sort of dictate or direct the writing that you're doing. Keep those things in mind, but also write the story that feels like your truth. And have fun with that.
Yeah, to just piggyback on
Yeah.
what you were saying,
Go
Morgan,
ahead.
I feel like if you're telling your stories, you do like sometimes end up pushing back against those things without even necessarily meaning to. And that's just like a wonderful byproduct, I think. And
I would say also, don't be afraid to really go there with the weirdness or what other people might perceive as weirdness. You know, it might not be commercially as accepted, but it's hard to write with that in mind anyway. You know, you have to write who you are, the way you write. But I would say, you know, revel in that, revel in your unique imagination born of your experience and your perception. Because also it's more fun that way.
Love that. Yeah, and I think it's so interesting thinking about queer writers feeling like they can't tell a story because it's been told. Like, the amount of queer books out there is such a small percentage compared to everything else, right? So yeah, I love your advice. Well, it's time for us to wrap up. This has been amazing to hear from y'all and get to know you. Thank you so much. I want to thank y'all for the discussion, and to everyone who tuned in. Please consider buying these amazing books from your local bookseller using the links in the chat or on vabook.org. You can also explore the rest of the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book schedule, which runs through March 20th at vabook.org. And again, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. So it was really nice to hear from you. I hope y'all have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.